Hello everyone, welcome to our next session of Rock the Closing. Today we are going to talk about closing costs and what you have to be aware of, how much additional money you need in order to close the transaction. So this money is all above the purchase price. Let's talk details. Dalia, my first question for you is, do you give your clients a closing estimate? Do you discuss with them the closing costs? If you do, when do you do that? How do you proceed about that?
Thank you, Arcelia. So this is really important, actually. So I talk about this topic with them at the very beginning of the transaction, right around the time we are looking at the contract. If we're drafting it, if we're reviewing it from a seller, I definitely want to talk to them about closing costs because not every purchaser or seller is aware of these additional costs. They're just looking at, well, here's the price of the house, here's what I'll be getting, or here's what I'll be paying, and that's that. And that's all I need. I need it to the dollar. And that's not the case. So I do like to go over it pretty early. I discuss with them all the possible closing costs because at that point in the transaction, I really don't know what the circumstances of the deal will be. We'll talk about it a little bit later on. There's so many different closing costs that may apply and some may not apply. So I just want to make them aware of what those could be and about how much they could be. Of course, they may not apply. They may be wildly different than, my last closing. So, it's important just to make sure that they're aware that they may need to have extra cash available or be expecting less than the purchase price at closing. Okay. What I talk about with them and when pretty early on. How about you? When do you talk about it with them, Arcelia?
My process is that when client is asking me, I'm also having a conversation with them before they go into contract. And if they ask for it specifically, I am even happy to provide them with a written closing cost estimate. But definitely after they go into contract, I am giving them a closing cost estimate in writing. However, I make a very, very strict disclosure that this is just an estimate and any number that's provided in this outline is not exact figures and seller or buyer should not be relying on it because, as you say, there are certain costs that are coming up later in the process which we are not aware of the exact figures. Let me give you an example. For example, while we will know exactly how much brokerage fees the seller will have to pay to his broker, so we will be able to calculate that based on the purchase price to the penny. We will not be able to tell the seller that, hey, you own this amount on your mortgage that you will have to be paying back at the closing table. That's why there is a fluctuation of numbers, but a closing cost estimate can give a pretty good idea either to the seller or to the buyer what he will have to, or she will, or they will have to carry at the time of closing. But you know what? Let's go into details and let's just provide our guests with a little bit more, typical closing costs. Dalia, do you want to talk about what the seller will be paying for?
Yeah, absolutely. So as the seller, sign this contract and, you may be expecting that you're selling your house for $500,000. And you're going to walk out of your closing with a check for $500,000, and that's probably not going to be the case. So the sellers do have closing costs as well. I know sometimes when we think about closing costs, we just think about the buyer's closing costs, but certainly the seller has them too. So the first one I like to discuss with them is one that they already know. It's already set. It's their broker fee. So they have used a broker most likely to sell their home. And if they have, then that fee is going to be somewhere in the range of 5 or 6% a lot of times based on the brokerage that they go with, except if they go with 3% New York brokerage, I know that fee is basically cut in half. So they definitely want to shop around. I would say that's probably a step before they get to me, but maybe we'll go into that in another episode, shopping around for a great broker. The next thing I want to tell them is that their water bill must be paid and they must show proof of payment at the closing, or they must have a check written for the water bill. I have to see the last water bill. The buyer has to see it because water bill is really important. Sometimes people think that this is such a small cost, but if it's not paid and the closing happens, then this bill will attach to the home. Okay, so it will be the problem of the buyer. So the buyer definitely will be looking for that. All right, another seller's cost is going to be transfer tax. So that's going to be the responsibility of the seller. The New York State transfer tax will be 0.4% of the purchase price, and the New York City transfer tax is going to be 1% if the purchase price is $500,000 or less, or 1.425% if it's above $500,000. Okay? The seller will also be responsible for the property tax owed through the date of closing. So that makes sense because it may have been paid already and it may not have been paid yet based on the due date, right? So we want to make them aware of that. Also, when we run the title search, or when the buyer runs the title search, rather, there may come up judgments, liens, mortgages, all that stuff. That all needs to be paid at closing. If the seller is selling their co-op unit, we need to look at whether or not there's a flip tax by the co-op. So a flip tax is a fee that is payable to the co-op upon the sale of the unit. So this obviously varies with, different co-ops. It may be somewhere between 1 to 3%, but I have seen it go much higher than that. So that's something that we would be finding out in the course of the deal. Another fee that the seller has will be their own attorney's fee. So that would be whatever they agreed upon with their attorney for completing the deal and what's involved with that. And if there are any add-ons, what have you. It is usually a flat fee, but not always. If they do have a mortgage on the house, we will be looking at a bank attorney fee for the payoff amount. If they are in a building and not a private home, we will also be looking at a move-out fee. Usually buildings do charge this. This can be, a few $100s. So we'll be getting that information from the board as well. And finally, a building management closing fee. And that can be anywhere from like $1,000 to $2,000 typically. All right. So these are a lot of the seller's closing costs. Like I said earlier, I don't know what the circumstances are going into the deal. So some of these might apply, some of them might not apply, and there may be other ones that, we don't anticipate at the beginning. So, we just have to see how it goes and just always keep in contact and keep communicating about what's coming up in the deal. So that's for the seller. Vassilia, what are the typical closing costs for a buyer?
Great. Let me start with probably the most heftiest fee. So if the buyer is purchasing a property that's above $1 million, and it doesn't matter if it's a co-op, condo, or house, then they will have to pay a so-called mansion tax, which is 1% of the purchase price. If the buyer is taking out a mortgage, there will be lots of fees associated with that. Lender's attorney, mortgage fees, mortgage broker fees. So again, that's one of the heftiest expenses. Then there will be homeowner's insurance, especially if there is a mortgage involved. There is definitely a homeowner's insurance. Often, if a buyer is moving into a condo or a co-op, the building is requiring the next month maintenance or common charges ahead of time, which again can add up. Then there is the usual fees, condos and co-ops, again, the moving in cost. So buildings are charging if you are moving in, you cause inconveniences for the building, for management. So they will charge you a certain amount, couple of hundreds. And there is usually also a deposit charge in case you are move-in deposit, in case during your move make any damage to the building, then you will be paying it from your deposit that the building takes. And again, back to condos and houses, there is a so-called title insurance, which is an owner's policy, which ensures that this is a clean and marketable title that you are taking out. And these have become quite hefty lately, and that's something that you will not be able to negotiate. And it's in your interest to take it out and have it. You won't be able to, for example, get a mortgage without a title insurance. And then there will be smaller fees, which would be the title search, which happens during the process. If it's a condo and a house, there is a so-called title search. When it's a co-op, it's a lien search. this would be a couple of $100, but it's important to search the history of the property, what kind of encumbrances are on this property, and so on and so forth. So this is a document that you need for your due diligence. Obviously, you will be responsible for picking up that fee. And just to mention that if you are purchasing a new construction, especially a new condominium apartment, then very often it's now becoming a trend that the seller is pushing the New York City and the New York State transfer taxes over to the buyer to be paid. Be aware this is the responsibility of the seller. However, contractually, the parties can agree that these two taxes are paid by the buyer. It's, again, part of the negotiation process. And let me mention that probably your lowest headache will be the attorney fees that you are paying your guiding attorney to go through this whole complicated transaction process. Okay. Dalia, there is an impression when you talk to people that it is cheaper to purchase co-ops than condos. Why is that? So we are looking at now from a buyer's perspective. Why are co-ops cheaper than condos?
Yeah, actually, there is this impression. I just had a client go back and forth about buying, should I buy a co-op? Should I buy a condo? Co-ops are cheaper. It's less of a headache, all this kind of stuff with regard to the closing. And it's not necessarily the case. The real difference between the closing costs of a co-op and a condo are the mortgage recording tax, which is 1.4% of the purchase price. And that does apply to condos and houses. So that means that if the buyer is taking out a mortgage, then they have to pay the mortgage recording tax. So that's going to be that 1.4% of the purchase price. Now, co-ops do not have that tax because they are not real property. So that wouldn't apply. That's really the only real difference with regard to buying the co-op and the condo. Now, the purchase price, that's a whole different story, but we're just talking about closing costs today. So we did want to make that clear that it's not like the closing costs get cut in half when you have this. So when you're purchasing a co-op rather than a condo, it's not the case for the closing cost. So I feel like we've covered a lot of the buyers and the sellers' closing costs and what to expect. Or Celia, can you think of any additional costs or credits that might come up at closing?
Yeah, let's look more closely into what kind of credits there could be. So, for example, there is a purchase price set, but then the buyer and the seller may start to negotiate for further credits. What could this be? Again, everything depends on the negotiations between the buyer and the seller or their respective brokers. But here are a couple of ideas. First, credits can come up at the very early stages before we are going into contract. Credits can be given when we are already in contract, and credits can be given up until prior to the closing or even at the closing table. So here are a couple of them. For example, the buyer inspects premises, brings in an inspector, and they discover some kind of hidden damages before the contract is signed during the due diligence process. The buyer may reach out through either the attorney or the broker to the seller and request credit for that. And the seller may agree to it, that, yes, I give you a certain amount of credit at closing from the purchase price. This can be any issue related to any kind of damage or anything. Then, for example, we go into contract, and then when it's a house, usually there is a requirement to hire an appraisal if a mortgage is taken out, and the appraisal comes back and says, hey, I see the purchase price is set as $600,000, but based on my comparables and the research I did into the house and the neighborhood, I think that this house is only worth $580,000. In that case, again, there will be a negotiation to lower the price or give a credit at the time of closing. Again, that could be a good example for a credit after we are already in contract. Another example for a credit would be after we have signed a contract, so we are in a binding transaction, would be, for example, a co-op or condo is sold, and then the board decides an assessment that has to be paid over the course of the next 4 or 5 months, which was neither the seller nor the buyer was aware of at the time they signed the contract. And then the seller may say, okay, this was an unknown fact. I'm happy to take over this assessment and pay for the entire sum at the time of closing. And then let's look at it towards the very end. Usually before closing, there is a walkthrough, a final review if everything is, as it was agreed at the time of signing the contract. However, anything can happen, a big rainstorm that causes any damages, one of the appliances stops working. So anything that may come up during the final walkthrough may lead that the seller gives credit to the buyer, which is given at the closing. Anyway, these were just a few examples, but anything can happen, and it's always a negotiation between the seller and the buyer, their respective representatives. Okay, there is one more course, Dani, I think we haven't talked about in detail, and that we call it adjustments. What are these adjustments and how to handle them, how to interpret them? Could you shed some light, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Adjustments are just what they sound like. So basically, once we sort of have all of our costs, right, all of our fees, now we have to adjust who pays for what based on the closing date. So we really do need a firm closing date in order to calculate these adjustments. So it's very common that you don't have your final closing statement until, 2 days before your closing, because if it's been scheduled pretty quickly, then that's the date we need to use. And that's the date we start from to calculate these adjustments. So what is an adjustment? So if you're buying or selling a condo or a co-op, right? So we look at what is the maintenance fee, the common charges, the taxes, right? When are those due? And what has been paid up until the date of the closing. So for instance, let's say your maintenance for the month of July has already been paid, right? Like you're the seller, you paid your maintenance for July. Now you're closing on July 10th, okay? After the 10th, you don't live there anymore. You shouldn't have to have paid the rest of the month's maintenance for the buyer. So an adjustment will be made where at closing, you will be given back the rest of the month after the 10th of the maintenance fee that you paid. So that's the idea. The same will go for the common charges as well as the taxes. So sometimes things are not billed quickly. And so whatever the billing situation is, like with taxes, if something is billed quarterly or what have you, we will calculate it to the day, per diem, whatever it takes to make sure that as a seller, you have just paid up until the day you left. And as a buyer, you have started paying from the day you take possession, which is the day of closing. So, right. So for co-ops, condos, that'll be, like I mentioned, the common charges, the taxes, the maintenance. When it comes to a private house, we're looking at the fuel costs, right? So do you have a big oil tank that's full of oil? And how much did you pay for that? And how many gallons are in there? And you're basically going to be selling that fuel at the closing to the buyer. Your water usage, okay? Was it did you pay the water, right? We'll have a water reading, utility charges, all that kind of stuff right up until the day of closing. All right. That's basically what we're looking at for adjustments. What else can we talk about with regard to closing fees? Rosalia, can you think of any situations that money is held back or not paid in full to the seller at closing?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So money is usually held back, meaning that the seller's attorney will be required to hold monies on the escrow account, which is the specialized attorney account, and it cannot be released to the seller until the buyer's attorney agrees to it. Some situations would be, for example, that they made some modifications in the house, they are open permit, there is no certificate of occupancy, and the seller committed to obtain a certificate of occupancy for the house, and then the money is held back as long as the certificate of occupancy is obtained. Or there is a huge violation that hasn't been paid for, then this has been held back. Or clearing an open permit. So for example, condo co-ops, seller made some significant modifications, put some permits to change the electricity lines throughout the apartment, but never closed off the permit. In that case, there will be a calculation how much the closing out of the permit would cost. And then this money is then held back until it's signed off, closed off, and then the money can be released to the sellers. So there are many scenarios for that, but I just wanted to mention a few. And I think that's it from our end. Be ready to pay way above purchase price regarding closing costs. Dalia, do you want to conclude?
Yeah, I agree. Closing costs are kind of a wild card, and we definitely have to prepare the clients for what's to come because a lot of people are not aware. And I think, we talked a lot today. It's like, I almost didn't realize myself how many various closing costs there were for all these sellers and buyers, but it's true. There are so many possible ones. So thank you so much for joining us on this discussion and this journey through the closing costs. And we hope to see you soon at our next episode of Rock the Closing. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in to Rock the Closing. This podcast is hosted by real estate attorneys who offer valuable insights. Please remember that the content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making any decisions. This podcast is copyrighted by Rock the Closing, and any reproduction, syndication, or rebroadcasting of the content requires written permission.